Hi, I'm Daniel.omorain. I'm a monitor, and I've created this deck plates clinical research monitoring YouTube channel because I've been monitoring for about 10 years and I've learned a bunch of stuff along the way, and I thought I'd share it with my colleagues, especially my newer ones, maybe to help them become a little bit better at monitoring. So I'm going to talk today about the inspection of a signed consent form. I think monitors have a very important, critical role in the clinical research process because there's some things that happen at the site that only we will know about and be able to inspect and assess. One of them is consenting. Another one is making sure that all the adverse events that have occurred are captured in the CRF, but that's the topic of another YouTube. So today we're going to talk about the inspection of a signed consent form. I use Excel workbooks a lot, and I have a worksheet that's basically a checklist for how I inspect signed consent forms. So what I'm going to do is go over that checklist. Maybe you can pick up some new tips. And after that, I am going to tell you a story about an odd thing that happened at one of my sites and a confession. So this is how I do the inspection of a signed consent form. In my worksheet, I have down the left-hand column is the site. Then I have the subject number, the screening number, as well as the randomization number. When I have monitored it, and then the ICF version. So my experience has been that, especially at the bigger sites, there are a lot of identifiers on the consent form. They call them template version, IRB version, tracking number. They're just a whole bunch of identifiers. Some I can understand, some I don't. So what I do is on my tracker, I capture all of the identifiers. Most CROs and sponsors have a CTMS that this is captured. So I use the ICF version in the CTMS. So then I have a column for the date that it was monitored. ICF version. All right, so recently I added a column for, is the ICF version the current version? And sure enough, shortly after I added this to the my checklist, I found a problem. It's very easy to do almost in every part of clinical research monitoring. It's very easy to do a perfunctory job, a superficial job. For consentings, and I've been guilty of this, and this is how I got a lot better, that I used to be very perfunctory, and I got busted. I thought I was doing a reasonably good job, but I wasn't. So anyway, this new line is the ICF version current? So I was at a site, I looked at the ICF, I looked at the identifier, and then I went back to the reg binder to see whether that consent version was the most current. And sure enough, I could not find any documentation that this consent form had been approved by the IRB. Very weird. And what it came down to was that there was a typographical error on the consent form itself. There was a slash used instead of a number. So there was no way of calibrating or matching the ICF version to the approval. So that was a pretty big issue. So I was lucky that I caught that, actually. what I was looking for is just to make sure that the version that was signed was the most current. And I've run across this, that they have used the wrong one. You know, especially for non-tech savvy sites, the coordinator just goes in the reg binder and gets the top version. And sometimes that's not the current version. So part of my checklist is making sure that the version that was signed is the most current version. Now, the simple thing is that I check to make sure that all of the pages that should be in the consent form are. So this is very tedious. I go through it and I make sure that almost all the pages are labeled as X of Y. So like page 1 of 28, 2 of 28, 3 of 28, so on. So I make sure they're all there. Then, while I'm doing that, I make sure that all the pages correspond to the same consent form. You know, it's a wild world out there, and sometimes pages get mixed. So there might be a consent form for a different study, or a page for a different study, or a page from a prior version. You don't know. So for every page that's in the signed consent form, make sure it's for the correct study and the correct version. So obviously, I want to make sure that the subject signed the consent form. Is there a signature there? And I want to note in my trackers when the subject signed the consent form. Sometimes the consent forms require a subject signature or subject initialing either each page or the salience, an acknowledgement of risks or procedures or something. So if there is a place for the subject to sign the consent form, I make sure that initialed, and make sure they are. So what I do is when I'm reviewing the consent form, I have the delegation log with me. In another video, I'll talk to you about how I do the actual on-site monitoring visit, but one of the first things I do is I make a copy of the delegation log in the 1572. So what I do with the consent form is I compare the signature of the staff member who signed the consent form to the signature that's on the delegation log. So I use the phrase delegation log. Most recently, that form is actually called the Site Signature and Delegation of Responsibilities log, which is a lot of syllables, but obviously it does include a signature line and an initial line for the staff members. So I make sure they're the same. They should be. And I have actually come across a situation where it's not. So, you know, we as monitors, we're making sure that there is no fraudulent activity. Okay, that is the F word. I'm not looking for it, but I'm making sure that there isn't. So if the signature for the staff member on the consent form is different than the one on the delegation log, I have to ask a question. Which is wrong? And who actually signed the consent form? So another thing I do is if the subject has signed more than one consent form, I look at the other consent forms that have been signed and compare the signature. Are they both written in the same way? Script versus written? You know, just grossly look at it. Do they look like they were written by the same person? You know, I even look at the color of the pen. All right, so here's a big one. The date of the first study procedure. So as you know, we have to make sure that no studies procedures were done before consenting. Most of the consent forms that I review do not have a line for the time of consenting to be done, but some do. And what I do is I go through the schedule of events for the subject and identify things that I think are not standard of care. So frequently this would be, for oncology studies, in my experience, EKGs. And there are other ones, you know, biopsies, bone marrow aspirations. So just go through the schedule of events and find out what's odd or not standard of care. And then almost always those things will have a time on it, you know, and even, well, if the consent form is timed, it's easy to see if it was done before, the procedure was done before. If the procedure was done on the same day of consenting, you need to ask the site to document that no procedures were done before consenting. So sure enough, I did do this. You know, I do this on everyone. Unfortunately, this site, the time of consenting had to be entered, and I compared it to the time and date of the EKG, and sure enough, the EKG was done before consenting, which is, I think, really, really bad. Maybe later on I'll go into like the big picture of consenting and what we're presenting to the subjects and asking them to do. It's a lot. I think, especially in oncology, the subjects are terrified. Their attention span is in the nanoseconds. They have a choice between being eaten by a tiger and eaten by a lion. They're not scared. They're not thinking straight. And when someone says, "Listen, we're going to do this. We're going to consent you next Tuesday. Come in at 12. We'll do the EKG, and then after that, we'll do the consent form, and we'll, you know." And they'll say, "Okay, I'll do that." Not thinking about what's right and what's wrong. They don't know, but we do. So anyway, make sure that no study procedures were done before the time of consenting. Going back to the responsibility log, I make sure that the staff member who signed the consent form has been delegated that. You know, this log is a responsibilities delegation as well as signature log. Then the PI needs to delegate or assign that responsibility. Am I being clear there? Make sure the person has been delegated that role. So another thing I check is the documentation of the consenting process. So there are a few things that I look for. One, that there was documentation that a copy of the consent was given to the subject, and that is in the Code of Federal Regulations 50.27. Documentation that no study procedures were done before consenting. That the subject was given an opportunity to ask questions, and that's in ICH section 4.8.7. So sometimes there are separate consents for different kinds of things. Sometimes there's a separate consent form for HIPAA. Sometimes there is a different one for storage of biological specimens. They're different ones. So you obviously have to know what your study calls for and make sure all of them have been done. Okay, so something that is not on my checklist that should be, and it will be, is any kind of documentation that the subject speaks English. So this is my story. I was at a site in downstate New York, and when I review the source documentation, I'm pretty thorough about reading almost everything. I read the doctor's notes, the infusionist notes, the study coordinator notes, basically all of the notes. That's important. That's a really important part of what we do. So anyway, I was reading through that, and sure enough, it says, this subject does not speak English. This subject speaks only Russian. But an English consent form was signed. So that was a problem. I had to address that, and obviously that leapt to the top of my to-do list for that day. That warranted a meeting with the PI. talk about my findings and recommendations for action, and a request for a follow-up for them for either training or change in process. So the bigger picture is, how do we know that the subject speaks English? You know, for me it was easy because the site says this person speaks only Russian. But in a normal study, how do we know? Just because a person has an Anglican name or a, you know, Western name, do they speak English? Not necessarily. To be honest with you, I don't know what the answer to that question is. I'll broach it with the site going forward and say, is there any documentation that this person speaks English? You might want to include that in someone's progress notes. And thinking even at a higher altitude, how do we assess for understanding? How do we assess that the person who is signing that consent form understands what's written there? So that's it for my checklist. But I just want to step back here and say something about consenting. So most of my work has been done in oncology. So needless to say, when these people get the diagnosis, either their primary diagnosis or metastasis, or, you know, like they fail a line, they're wigging out. They're freaking because the blue light is getting dim, right? It's turning on. And so we go to someone goes to them and says, listen, we have another plan here. It's a research study, and this is a consent form, and I know it's 27 pages long, but I'm going to go over it with you, and you can answer any question, ask any questions, and you can even go home and talk about it with your family. So I know from my own experience, when I'm stressed out, my attention span is almost microscopic, and I do not have the attention span to look through 27 pages of text to make a really rational decision about whether this is something I want to do. Especially oncology. I mean, more recently the drugs are pretty benign. The side effects are not, I'm going to say, rapacious, because they are kind of. They used to be anyway. So anyway, for the site staff, what is the word? I'm going to say it, be patient and kind. These people are wigging. They don't want to be rushed, but they can be because they're in a bad negotiating position. Go slow. Answer the questions. Ask open-ended questions. And then as monitors, you know, make sure it's done right, because this is just paperwork. This is not tissue and drugs. And it's sort of an easy thing for people to not give it their full attention because it is not therapeutic. It's administrative. Anyway, that's my soapbox, and that's how I do consent forms. So listen, I've caught a lot of mistakes. My consent form checklist here is pretty thorough. So take what you want and leave the rest, as they say. And that's all I've got for this session. Thank you.